have absolutely no experience in or expertise in any of the subjects going to be discussed today, but I have one important skill. I know how to tell time. And so that is my job, to moderate this panel. So thanks for being here. You all have a program. So let me just quickly remind you of who is presenting today. First is going to be Aaron Hustings, who's from, I have to read, the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials, the Educational Fund. Next up will be Henry Flores from St. Mary's, who will be talking about, he said, redistricting, voter ID, and racism in public policy in Texas. Okay. And finally, from the Communication Studies Department here at UT, Laura. In case you haven't noticed, I have an Anglo tongue, so I'm being schooled in pronunciation. Barbarena, who is, in addition to her work here at UT, also a political consultant, works in San Antonio. And that is it for me. I am simply going to tell time after this. We're going to try and keep the presentations to about 15 to 20 minutes, so we have a good half hour for conversation after. Take it away, Erin.
Thank you. Bob is a tough act to follow. I sort of hate to be the first one because I don't know. I don't think I have the thank you, the oomph in me. But I'll try. Hopefully, you guys are a self-selecting group. You're interested in this stuff. So to frame what I'm talking about and why I wanted to talk about it, the language access provisions of the Voting Rights Act have a broad reach, arguably, or maybe, in pretty much actual fact, a broader reach, a broader geographic reach than other parts of the Voting Rights Act, certainly today, for Latino voters, and a big potential impact, and more about that later. But their effectiveness, we know, is limited by things like a lack of compliance. And there's been lots of study and documentation of that, and ongoing litigation, which also proves that case, as well as lack of awareness that there is language assistance at the polls in a lot of places around the country. We at NALEO run a year-round bilingual voter assistance hotline, and we always, every election cycle, on a regular basis, get calls from voters, including from places where there's a large Latino population, there's a large Spanish-speaking population, and there's a longstanding obligation to have bilingual elections. We always get calls from people who are wondering, is there going to be a Spanish ballot, or is there going to be Spanish assistance at my polling place? So people still don't know what's out there and where it is. Both the lack of compliance and the lack of awareness should be remedied in some part by litigation. But the volume of litigation, many of you, or all of you probably know, has, at least the litigation that we can all see and that we know about, has declined in recent years. So we wanted to set out to gauge and to kind of demonstrate the effectiveness of language enforcement actions, not just language assistance, but litigation to enforce those obligations, with a view to making sure that they remain in place. Another level of this is that many or all of you probably know that there was serious debate in 2006, the last time the Voting Rights Act was actively debated in Congress, about removing the language assistance provisions. And it's a favorite pet project of Steve King and many people who remain in Congress. So it's not just theoretical that unless we continue to defend and call for these provisions, we could lose them. And that would be unfortunate.
The same Stephen King that said that Mexicans have calves like cantaloupes?
That's the one. Are you surprised? Sure. Yeah. All sorts of iterations of English only. One of them is no more language assistance provisions in the Voting Rights Act. I'm sorry, you can't really see what I'm showing you here. Of course, we need language assistance provisions because Latino voting power is not what it should be. Everybody knows the Latino electorate continues to grow. This is Latino presence in Congress. So here's blue. Here's what percentage of the electorate Latino voters are, the eligible electorate to vote. here's what percentage of members of Congress Latinos are, much lower, like 5%-ish and 11%. Latinos are seriously underrepresented in office. And one of the reasons is, here's voter turnout in congressional years, and here's voter turnout in presidential years. Everybody knows that voter turnout has not been looking good and has been on the decline in recent years. At the same time, the theoretical need for language assistance continues to grow. So here's the green line is the total citizen voting age population, not fully fluent in English. That includes speakers of every language under the sun. And the blue line is Latino voters, not fully fluent in English. And the absolute numbers continue to rise among both of those populations. This is the percentage of voters. The percentage of all voters who need language assistance continues to rise. It's the green line. The percentage of Latino voters who need language assistance has actually been declining modestly, but we're still at over 20%. About 5 million eligible voters around the country. The language assistance provisions, oh man, this is hard to see, I'm sorry. The language assistance, on my version, the logo was like shaded.
Yeah.
The language assistance provisions that I'm talking about and that have been enforced in the past are Section 4E. This was in the original Voting Rights Act, and you've probably actually all heard about it at some point today. So that's pretty much applicable to voters of Puerto Rican origin, and has an indefinite geographic scope, but very particular and definite obligations have been imposed upon certain jurisdictions through litigation. So there are some places that know exactly what they need to do to serve their Puerto Rican voters. Sections 4F4 and 203 came into being in 1975. 203 is active. Many or all of you know that starting next year, for the first time, we're going to get new Section 203 determinations every 5 years instead of every 10 years. Previously, it's been every decade after the census came out. We got a new list of jurisdictions that had to provide language assistance under Section 203. And now, for the first time next year, we'll get a 5-year update. We'll see what that gives us. Section 4F4, let's discuss that later if anybody is interested in discussing. I've talked to some other colleagues of mine about this, and it wasn't explicitly invalidated by the Shelby County decision, but the consensus seems to be that we probably aren't going to get any language assistance obligations under that section anymore following Shelby County, because it refers back to coverage that's determined by the part of the Voting Rights Act that was invalidated. Excuse me. And then finally, Section 208, which you can't see very well, came into being in 1982. This requires that any voter anywhere in the country be allowed to bring the person of their choice, except for their employer or their union representative. I know we have some union folks here.
Very clear about that one.
Yes. But other than your employer or your union representative, you have the right to bring any person into the polls with you to help you vote. And that could be, in the case that you have a disability and you need say you can't see, or if you can't read what's on the ballot, you can bring somebody in to translate for you. Sorry about the big naleo there. Over the course of the last 50 years, because those provisions were added onto each other, we've gotten kind of progressive growth of the scope of how far those provisions reach. In total, I tell you over here, which you can't see, that more than 500 jurisdictions over these past 50 years have had some sort of defined, definite, well-known, well-recognized obligations to provide language assistance. most of you also know, though, that language assistance is only available to people who speak Spanish, Native American languages, and Asian languages. If you speak an African language, let's say, or Creole, no language assistance. And that was because those were the communities of people that Congress determined had been historically discriminated against in elections. Here we are at our most recent, I guess a couple of things that I think are interesting here. Section 4E was used at the outset of the voting, or there was litigation under Section 4E at the outset of the Voting Rights Act. And through that process, it was kind of determined what exactly Section 4E meant, because the law just says that no person who was educated in a language other than English in an American flag school, which is pretty much Puerto Rico, shall be prevented from voting because of their lack of fluency in English. So what does that mean? Eventually we got to the point where it was kind of interpreted to mean that places with at least 5% Puerto Rican population, at least some places that happened to have been sued that had at least 5% Puerto Rican population, were going to be required to provide assistance. That standard was kind of imported into Section 4F4 and 203. So to make a gross overgeneralization, places, according to the federal law, there are state and local laws that sometimes provide even better protections. But places with at least 5% of the voting eligible population that isn't fully fluent in English, and under Section 203, 5% or 10,000 people, and those people have a higher than average illiteracy rate than the general population, have to provide assistance in another language. So at the last determination, we had over 250 cities, counties, states that had very specific defined obligations, most of them in Spanish. And many of those also in another language, in more than one language, but Spanish was the most common. Language assistance is important, not just for people who need it to vote, who aren't fully fluent in English. There's been a good body of research, and this rings true in the conversations that I had in the lead up to this presentation with people, that the problems, inadequate provision of language assistance often goes hand in hand with other problems at the polls. Things like hostility towards voters who look different than the poll workers, coercive behavior, other problems, to make a long story short, go alongside inadequate provision of language assistance. And those are problems that affect any voter, not just voters who aren't fully fluent in English. So this is a pie chart that represents all of the successfully litigated cases concerning language assistance in the past 15 years. There were 37, I think, in total, and about a third of them involved explicit, I was reading in the complaint, there were explicit allegations of something else going on at the same time. And the bit you can't read there is some examples, sorry, which I also can't read on the screen. Well, we can go back to that, but you can imagine what kinds of things I'm talking about. One of the most visceral cases came from Berks County, Pennsylvania, and the reason I say that's the most visceral too is because actually it was pretty much the only one of these 37 cases that went to a full trial. And so there was a full airing of people's complaints that you don't necessarily get when a case is filed and resolved quickly. So we had a number of voters from that area testifying about having been told by poll workers, you Latinos, you shouldn't have two names. You should have to choose one name, and you should have to speak English to vote, and other assorted comments like that. So it wasn't just we weren't providing assistance in Spanish, it was also that we were kind of saying you shouldn't be voting. Now here's some of the typical characteristics of a successful language assistance case. As I said, almost all of them, with pretty much one major exception in the last 15 years, have been resolved quickly, which in many cases literally means that and the Department of Justice has handled most of these, and Latino Justice Pro Def has also done some significant litigation. So the Department of Justice will file a suit, and then on the same day or a couple of weeks later, they'll file the consent decree or the agreement between the resolution and the lawyers that ends the case. The jurisdictions don't, for the most part, you can see they don't want to fight this. And the people who are suing them have been in touch with the jurisdiction for some time before they actually file a suit, trying to work out a resolution that's a little bit quicker and easier. The beauty of this and there's no admission of liability, not in all cases, but in many cases. So the jurisdiction kind of doesn't have to look bad, or doesn't have to look really bad coming out of this. And that's a plus and minus. Theoretically, you can file more cases, you can do more work when you don't have to fight it out all the way through a full-blown trial. They should be able to have a bigger impact. But you also don't get as much of the airing of really what's going on, and as it turns out, as much public attention, which we'll talk about a little bit. There are very specific requirements, to make a long story short for the rest of this, in the agreements. And this seems to work pretty well. So the lawyers who are suing will specify that a jurisdiction needs to translate materials, and not just all materials, because that's what the law already says, but specific things. The resolution agreements will say you have to translate the ballots, the voter guide, whatever specific materials they found have not been translated in the past. There are public announcements about not just the availability of language assistance, but also that there's an election happening and that the jurisdiction is hiring bilingual poll workers. Many of these agreements, or most of them, are very specific about the number of bilingual poll workers and bilingual workers the jurisdiction is required to have based on its size and its particular needs. And there are backups prescribed in many of these agreements too, because something you hear from every jurisdiction out there is, we can't find enough bilingual poll workers, we can't recruit, we have problems recruiting. So they've tried to say, okay, fine, we know it's almost like they're saying in advance, we know you're going to have problems recruiting, so here's some other things you can do, like engage people who will do translations by phone, for example, or have a pool of backup bilingual poll workers to fill in where somebody doesn't show up. Poll workers are trained on language assistance, rights, and resources. Bilingual services coordinators and advisory groups are required to be hired and set up. That's an important way that it seems, from what I've heard, that the word gets out into the community. And the jurisdictions submit to ongoing monitoring. So how well does this work? We tried to look at whether we could see any increase in voter participation after versus before a successful language assistance case had been prosecuted. And though research has found some of that evidence in the past, again, to make a long story short, the data sets that I had available to me, I didn't think could tell me something I was confident enough about to present it to you today. The Census Bureau's current population survey, I want to know specifically about Latino voters, right? So this is based on a relatively small sample of the population, and when you get down to the city and the county level, sometimes they don't have enough responses to their survey to even publish any kind of data about something as a group as relatively small as Latino voters in Springfield, Massachusetts, let's say. So there's lots of missing data, and there's some weird deviations when I looked at this that I think deserve a little bit more investigation. I also have access to some voter data files, but people who've let's say voted in 2000 and then since moved to another jurisdiction have in many cases been taken off the voter data file. So let's say you voted in Austin in 2000 and then you moved to Houston and you re-registered there, you know, through whatever process. If you've been taken off the list in Austin, I can no longer see what your vote was in Austin in 2000 and 2002. So there's too many holes in that to really tell where we are with voter participation. The past research has been a little bit mixed, but people do think that there's, some people have seen some benefit, some increase in voter participation. So here's what I do think I could tell, which is that there does seem to be some increase after as compared to before a language assistance case is prosecuted in Latinos running for office. This data, again, is hard to see, and it won't make a lot of sense unless you know what the operative year is. But just to give you a few examples here and on the next slide, and we're still working on building this data. But so far, what I see in this is reinforced by what people in these jurisdictions have actually told me when I've interviewed them. Yakima County, Washington was successfully sued in 2004 over its language assistance. In 2001, 14.4% of candidates running for office in the county were Latino. In 2003, 15.2%. Then we have the litigation in 2004. 2005 and 2007, 17.6% of candidates running in the county were Latino. Riverside County, California, sued in 2010. In 2008, 14.1% of candidates are Latino. In 2012, after the litigation, 16.8% of candidates were Latino. Springfield, Massachusetts, sued in 2006. 2005, before the litigation, 15.8% of candidates were Latino in the city. 2009, after the litigation is resolved, 23.1% of candidates in the city are Latino. So why is that? If there is, in fact, more of a, and this is kind of what I got when I talked to elected officials, former, current elected officials, and people who've run for office in many of the jurisdictions that have been sued in the last 15 years. I talked to leaders of community-based organizations and some litigators as well. And they told me in a nutshell, before a lot of people don't know or don't talk much about language assistance at the polls in these jurisdictions. It's not a sexy topic. And actually, the litigation process, as it's played out in the past 15 years, at least, doesn't really do too much to raise awareness necessarily, or necessarily on its own to increase voter participation. The cases settle quickly. As I said, there's not a lot of drama or fanfare. There's not a lot of talk about what has gone wrong in the polling place, kind of in the media or otherwise. The Department of Justice puts out a press release, and I don't know who notices, but these cases, some people notice. These cases, this is a gross overgeneralization, but generally they fly under the radar. The people who hear about the cases and who know that something has changed and that the likes of the federal government or another big national organization are actively watching the polling places in the jurisdiction are sort of the grass tops. They're people who get asked to join advisory committees. They're leaders of community organizations. They're, in short, they're people who are fairly well politically engaged and knowledgeable to begin with. And it seems like those are the people who feel like maybe there's a little bit more opportunity, and those are the people who are most likely to run for office. And that's why I think that these language assistance cases have had an effect at that level. These language assistance cases, though, whatever their effect, they're worth doing because they really have had a positive influence on what's happening in polling places in these jurisdictions. People generally told me that things are better, even when the county is, or the city is struggling to recruit workers, or all the things that everybody says they have a problem with. They're making more of an effort, and people feel like the polling place is a better environment for Latino voters than it was before. So, lessons from this, I'll be really short. Language assistance cases are worth the investment. They bring about, or they at least set in motion, changes in local culture that are moving us in the right direction. But because they don't seem to be a single-handed catalyst to dramatically increase voter participation of the sort that we really need, we still need to ask people to vote. One of the best things that we've come up with at NALEO one of our first and foremost suggestions, or the things that we think might help improve turnout, are just not just creating a polling place that feels more comfortable. That's not the same as actually asking person by person by person, will you please come and vote? Will you please come and vote? And the closer you are to the person you're asking to vote, the better. If it's your abuela, if it's your mother, so much the better. That's about as good as we can do, and that's what lower propensity voters tell us is it would be most effective if somebody in my family asked me to vote, or if somebody I know and respect well asked me to vote. All this is all the more important because of where we are with the Voting Rights Act. The one thing I just want to say about this is kind of what I do in D.C. Is argue with congressional aides about what we should do about the Voting Rights Act, that kind of stuff. And people who aren't favorably inclined in the first place, their line over the past few years has been, what you've got still in the Voting Rights Act is good enough. But they're still going after what we've still got in the Voting Rights Act. So we really need to intensify our efforts to show that not just it's effective, but it's very much still needed. Because, yes, language assistance violations persist in 2015. These are a couple of calls that we've gotten, that we received in 2014. I'll tell you more about them if you'd like to know, but you all know that there's still people who are going to the polls and not finding language assistance where it should be. Please tell people to call our voter assistance hotline. It's really helpful to hear about this, and then we take it straight to Congress and to the people who can defend against violations in the courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Data matters and stories matter.
Yes.
Both of them.
Yes.
It's an important to remember. Thank you. Next up, Henry.
Okay. This is a story. Actually, this is several stories. So it matters like the data is going to matter. I have this story, or these stories. I have to give credit to Nina Perales, Vice President for Litigation of MALDEF, for these stories, because she's the one that started me on this journey. She hired me to be the expert witness in the most recent congressional redistricting lawsuit that Western District of Texas still has not written an opinion on. And this thing has been tied up since 2012. And I think it's not, the opinion hasn't been forthcoming because each of the judges, it's a 3-judge panel, each of the judges are writing a separate opinion, and there's some very, very important issues in this opinion that could be devastating to the voting rights community, and if it goes up to the Supreme Court a certain way. When Nina asked me to do this job, expert witnesses such as myself are experts in very little narrow parts of the law, and technically I was a Section 2 expert up until that day. And when I asked her who else was on the trial team, she told me, and I said, well, you don't need me because you've already got 2 Section 2 guys on there, Morgan Kauser from Caltech and Dick Engstrom from Duke. And she said, no, I don't want you to do Section 2 litigation. I want you to do racial intent. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, well, I don't know of any research on racial intent. I don't know what the methodology would be to look at racial intent. So, I mean, what am I going to do? And she said, well, you're going to invent it. I said, okay. Yeah, well, I love Nina. I mean, she's probably one of the best lawyers I've ever worked with. She's an amazing litigator and a really creative thinker. And after I went through the stories and went through the trial, and then I was asked to do the same thing in the Section 5 pre-clearance hearing on the voter ID law, which the D.C. Circuit ruled as unconstitutional as well. But it was put into effect because Shelby County came down a month later. And Governor Abbott immediately said, we're going to implement this law before anybody has any second thoughts about anything. And so that's why you have the voter ID case law, even though it's unconstitutional on its face. But after I went through both of those experiences and I sat down with everything and I thought about it and I looked at some of the witnesses on the stand, listened to what they had to say, I stayed for every day because I told Nina eventually, as I was doing the research on this, I said, I have to write a book about this. So I stayed and watched the trials and listened to everybody, and MALDEF was good enough to give me access to all the transcripts for the trials, which are really long. I never went through an entire trial transcript. You lawyers are amazing if you sit there and go through these things. I don't know how you need thick glasses. And expert reports, depositions of all kinds, and I went through the whole thing. And after I came up for air, I said, "This is interesting on many levels. One of them is you can't prove racial intent. You can prove racial intent if somebody says this." This is an email. I'm going to read you the email because I want you to listen to what racial intent sounds like. This is Friday, November 17th, 2010, 10:19 p.m. to Gerardo Interiano, CC Lisa Kaufman from Eric Opiella. Subject, a useful metric. Just had a thought. I needed to get out before I forget it. The raw data to calculate this is going to be in the PL 94-171 data set. That's the census. We'll get it in March, hopefully, but it would be really useful for someone to go in and calculate a ratio for every census block in the state of citizen voting age population over total population, a ratio of Hispanic citizen voting age population over total Hispanic population, a ratio of Spanish surname registered voters over Hispanic citizen voting age population, and a ratio of Spanish surname registered voters over total Hispanic population. Parentheses, these last two have to be calculated with a voter file overlaid with census data. It also would be good to calculate a Spanish surname turnout over total turnout ratio for the 2006 to 2010 general elections for all voting tabulation districts. And then in parentheses, I already have the data for this for 2006, 2008 in a spreadsheet, just need to gather it for every VTD for 2010. These metrics would be useful in identifying, quote, a nudge factor by which one can analyze which census blocks, when added to a particular district, especially 50+1 minority majority districts, help pull the district's total Hispanic population and Hispanic citizen voting age populations up to majority status, but leave the Spanish surname registered voters and turnout the lowest. This is especially valuable in shoring up Conseco and Ferent Hall. What they did was they created a metric to identify Latino precincts that had large numbers of Latinos in it, but that didn't turn out to vote, and went through the congressional districts and switched them out for the high turnout Latino precincts, so that the congressional district would look like a majority Hispanic district, but wouldn't perform as such. That's racial intent. They intentionally did that to manipulate Hispanic voters so that they could make sure that the congressional districts turned red. Right. That memo we got through discovery in another hearing, but it came out by accident. It was shipped to us, we saw it, and put it in the record, and it was devastating. I mean, the state tried to suppress it. They didn't want it out. But the two gentlemen that were emailing each other, one was the counsel for the Speaker of the House, the other was a counsel for the chairman of the State Redistricting Committee. Right. So these were guys that were going to give you the congressional maps and the state house maps and the state senate maps. When it came to the voter ID case, they suppressed everything. We couldn't get anything out of them, so we had no smoking gun at all. And so what I went and did was try to figure out. So I went through all the documentation, the legislative record, and everything that went into to the construction and design and the writing of Senate Bill 14, which is the Texas voter ID law. And the most interesting piece of datum that I found was the House Journal of March 23rd, 2011. And I invite you to pull it down. It's on the Ledge Council webpage. You can dig it up and look at it. It's the day that they tried to amend the Senate Bill 14 67 times. And I created a table in my shameless plug. I wrote a book about it. And Roman and Littlefield Press, it's very Latinos in the Voting Rights Act, came out in March. And if you're a friend of Rick, I can get you a special price. But anyway, and if you haven't seen the movie Casablanca, that went right over your head. It was a bad joke. On that particular day, it was really, really interesting because the Latino members of the House tried to raise this issue that, look, don't you think, and they were speaking to the sponsors of the bill. Patricia Harless was one of them, and you shake your head, you know Patricia. She's my girlfriend. I'm sure she'd curdle if she heard me say that. They would ask her, don't you think that the provisions of this bill violate the Voting Rights Act? And she said, no. Well, what if they did violate the Voting Rights Act? And then she came back and said, that's not our responsibility to worry about that. That's for the courts to tell us if we've done anything illegal. And I joked to a colleague of mine. It's like, oh, I'm sorry I shot you dead. I didn't know murder was illegal. Just take me to trial, prove it to me that it's illegal, and then I'll admit it if in fact that comes out in trial. Like they were openly violating the law and they didn't care. They wouldn't admit it. But the most striking thing that came out that day in the transcript was the word Hispanic was never mentioned by anybody except the minority legislators. The word race was never mentioned. It was like somebody had given all these folks the command to don't talk about race under any circumstances. They passed it over the objections of all the minority members. It was amended 5 times, very innocuous amendments. I think a couple of them are just grammar corrections. And there were 4 or 5 attempts now, I can't remember now, without going back in and looking at the data, by minority members to say that certain provisions of the bill would be would be illegal if the courts said that, it violated the Voting Rights Act during the Section 5 hearing. Every one of those motions was tabled. They couldn't get a second for them. And they'd continue the debate and so forth. A couple of times they got right down into arguing about discriminatory actions, and the other side would somebody would make a motion to table the discussion and they'd move on. And they wouldn't discuss it. They wouldn't discuss anything. So I went back to what Nina gave me to look at, to think about a methodology, and it appears in the Village of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation lawsuit, and it's in a footnote. And the judge said, this is some African Americans tried to bring lawsuit that the city had discriminated against them in putting together this housing project. And the court said, no, the city didn't do it. This is just strictly a zoning thing. It wasn't discriminatory. But in the footnote, one of the judges says, if you wanted to prove discrimination, you would do the following things. And then they cite cases for it. So I took every one of those things, and I started digging around looking for data. And that's how I built the racial intent model that I did. Then what I did was I refined it, so now it's not like 11 or 12 strange variables. It's only 4 that you have to prove in that particular case. Throughout the trial in D.C., I was sitting in the gallery and I was watching. I had to make a note. I was watching the sponsor of the bill sitting in front of me. His name is Senator Tommy Williams, and Senator Tommy Williams, you know, with all due respect to any Anglos in the room, now I know where the term redneck came from. The more he sat there and listened to the testimony, the redder and more angry he got. And he was shaking and sweating. By the third day, I thought he was going to explode. I mean, you know, just like, and I started asking myself, what is making this man so angry? I mean, what kind of questions could I ask to try to define what his situation is? Is it the fact that the three-judge panel is ripping apart Senate Bill 14 and the little baby's dying in the delivery room? Is it the fact that maybe he doesn't want to give up political power and he's being questioned, his authority is being questioned by these people in Washington, D.C. that don't know the facts of what's going on in Texas? Or is it the fact that the 2 twin Latina teenage girls that were the defendant interveners were challenging his white maleness, you know, and it was probably a combination of all those 3 things, which is what racism is all about. It's a multi-layered problem, and you can't define it. You can define it if you have a smoking gun, but you can't define it any other way. I ended up, in concluding in my book, asking more questions than anything else. And one of them was, what is racism? The second question was, how does racism find its way into the public policy process itself? And then, of course, how do you identify it without any kind of smoking guns? So, as I was leaving the stand, I'll come back to those questions in just a second. As I was leaving the stand, the judge, David Tatel, who is an interesting man in himself. I didn't realize the history he had with the Voting Rights Act when he was an attorney. But Judge Tatel is a senior judge now. I think his senior status is blind. Right? And I say, the more he could question me, I said, this is blind justice. And he, as I was getting ready to leave the stand, he stopped me and he said this. He asked me this question. He said, Dr. Flores, why should we be listening to your testimony here today? It's all in evidence here. It's all, you know. But what's so important about your testimony? And I said, I thought about it for a second. I said, oh, shoot, I didn't rehearse this. You know, Nina didn't tell me about this. And I said, well, Your Honor, I said, you know, you look at this from the perspective of a lawyer and a federal judge. I look at this from the perspective of a Chicano political scientist. And then I started explaining to him what that perception meant and how those kind of activities, even though race isn't mentioned, are really racial. And when we see them, we see race. When somebody else sees them, they may not see race. They might see economic efficiency. They might see something else altogether. But because the effect turns out to be race, that means the intent was really race and racial. And when I left the stand, a law student grabbed me and she said, that's the first time I've ever heard Chicano studies used in expert testimony. And I said, one of the things we have to do in a lot of these cases is tell our stories. Tell our legal argument from our point of view. Not just the letter of the law and the legal theories that the lawyers use that are traditional and that have been built up over the years, but our legal arguments, our legal stories, our history has to come in there and play a role in there. Racism, I came to the conclusion after I read all kinds of books on it that particular summer as I was writing this book, and then I finally said, nobody's got an answer for this. Nobody. They can tell you what a racial code word is. They can tell you, well, that's a racial word and the guy's a racist, or I beat you to death because you're a black person. That's a racial act, but the guy was saying it that way. He didn't beat him to death because he was a criminal. He beat him to death because he was a black person. That's a racial act. The other one is just a police officer beating a criminal to death. Two different things, two different perceptions. So I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to look for the definition of racism. It's an English word, so I went to Oxford. And if it was a Spanish word, I would have gone to the Academy's dictionary, but it's not a Spanish word. Racism is a belief. That's the first element of it. The second element is that you've defined the world in terms of these categories that you identify as race, and you give them a name: white, black, brown, yellow, whatever. And you also believe that your particular group is superior to the other ones. That's part of the definition. The third part of the definition is that you feel threatened from those other groups. Then I understood the anger in the courtroom, and I've begun to understand why the law, Senate Bill 14, and redistricting occurs the way they do. Because these guys feel threatened of you and me. And it's not that their authority is being threatened, although that's part of it, really. But this is, again, a multi-layered thing. It's not just the authority, but it's also, I guess, the hegemonic control of entire society and culture is being threatened. Because they see our culture as deficient. There's something wrong with our culture. And if we get into power, their culture is going to go in the toilet and it's going to become mongrelized. That's the word that they use. That's the exact word that they use. And so they have to do things to keep us from participating, having the ability to take political control, to assert ourselves. So what goes on in the voting rights area is that the gerrymandering is done so that we cannot have a voice. Voter ID laws are passed so that we cannot participate. Language provisions or English only is passed, again, so we can't participate. I made a list of different sorts of areas of public policy that, if you look at them and think about them just a little bit, every one of them is some way of controlling a racial minority group. Restrictive immigration policies. We've heard enough of that here today. Limited voting, I already talked about that. Restricted zoning, lending practices, redlining, segregated social clubs, segregated housing patterns, segregated public facilities, swimming pools. Who talked about swimming pools, right? Miscegenation laws. You can't marry somebody from another race. You can't have sex with somebody from another race. You know, just look at the taboo of that's still hanging around, all over this country practically. Dual language classes, the attacks on bilingual education, dual language classes, Chicano studies in Tucson, Arizona, and we wonder why our children don't understand the history of our people. It's because it's being suppressed. And it's being suppressed so that they don't develop a level of consciousness enough so that they can be politically active. And English-only laws in the workplace, in the voting place, and in the public place. So, I wasn't sure what I was going to say today because I didn't write anything. And so, I wrote the book. Again, you can get it at your local half-price used bookstore. No, I'm just teasing. But essentially, I'm moving, and I'm working my way as an expert witness, I'm learning more and more about racism and how it's finding its way into public policy in a lot of different areas, and why it's finding its way into public policy, and what its role is. And so I guess that's really the gist of my presentation, and that's where I'm actually going with my next book. So.
Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Laura, you finish up.
Great. So I'll try to keep it brief so we can all get along to the next phase of this wonderful conference, which is enjoying each other's company. But a few years ago, there was a young woman just west of San Antonio, a little community called Helotes. She was driving home from work. Came to a stop sign, stopped, looked both ways, then proceeded through the intersection. Got pulled over. She pulls over. Yes, officer, what did I do? Well, ma'am, you ran that stop sign. Well, I'm sorry, I thought I came to a complete stop, blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm sorry, license and registration. I don't have a license. What do you mean you don't have a license? I'm undocumented. Ma'am, I'm afraid I'm going to have to detain you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to arrest you. They took her in. I got to interview her as part of this research that I was doing about dreamers. She was an interesting, lovely young woman who, when she tells the story, she says, I've never been so afraid in my life. I got an attorney. I was going to be deported. I was going to get put to Mexico. I hadn't even been to Mexico since I was like 2 years old. She did speak Spanish. So she gets an attorney. She gets out of jail. And the attorney's like, I don't know what I can do for you. I mean, I'm sorry, you're going to get deported. Isn't there anything I can do? I'm a straight A student. I've never been in trouble in my life. Isn't there anything I can do? Well, you could write a letter to the editor to the New York Times, but, you know, it probably won't get printed, but what the hell? Shot in the dark. So she did it, and it got published. Several years later, she became the first speaker at a Democratic National Convention who was a dreamer, undocumented, and her name was Benita Veliz. She's also a St. Mary's grad. Yeah. Right, Dr. Cottrell? Yeah. An amazing young woman. And I thought, how ironic. Here's this young woman minding her own business. She didn't want to be politically active. She didn't want to be seen, be visible. She wanted to stay under the radar. She just wanted to go to school, go to work, stay invisible. The very laws that were put into place to sort of suppress this population, the deportation aspect, was the very laws that created an activist. She went from someone who was quiet, reserved, to being literally the face of the Dreamers on the national stage. Absolutely incredible. She was part of several interviews that I did with the professor, because one day I had gone, this is all part of the Voting Act and trying to suppress our vote. Southwest Voter had sponsored this conference because there was rumblings about the Voter ID Act about to pass. So Southwest Voter called together a conference to talk about what we could be doing as a community to prepare for that. And I think Lydia or somebody introduced me to this young woman who had been part of a hunger strike at UTSA. I met her. Okay. And after the conference, I went to a coffee shop, and I called up a professor, because he and I had done research on the walkouts during the 2006 marches and all the kids that walked out of the high schools. And we studied Dallas and all over Texas. And I called him up. I said, Dr. Young, there's something here. There are these people that did hunger strikes. There's something here. There's a story here. I don't know what it is, but let's look into it and let's explore. So we started doing interviews, and Benita was one of the ones that we got to interview. And we interviewed all these students as who participated in the hunger strikes at UTSA. And it was all part of the DREAM Act, because they were trying to bring attention and national media attention to the DREAM Act that was being considered by the Senate, which, by the way, ended up losing by 5 votes. And when you hear the story of these young activists talking about actually sitting in the chambers, Gabby Pacheco, you all may know her. She's been also very prominent in the media. She was part of the march that went from Miami to Washington and got to meet with President Obama. But she talks about sitting in the chamber, and when the vote came and they knew they'd lost, just that feeling of, now what do we do? Go fast forward to today's topic, which is this notion of current political engagement. And I started giving this a lot of thought. So, what is our current political engagement as Latinos? What is that? And in my world, what does that mean with respect to like activism? And I see a change going on. Years ago, when we talked about Latino empowerment and the Latino movement, it was Tejanos, it was multi-generational. When we talked about immigrants, it was laborers, guys with the hats and they're cutting your lawn. All of a sudden, that narrative changed. Suddenly it was dreamers, young people, a whole new face, a whole new dynamic to what we think about when we think about Latino political engagement. And so, as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today and the work that I do in politics and my colleague, James Alderete, who's here, we sit and we talk about this stuff all the time. How do we get more Latinos to vote, and what can we be doing, and because that's what we get asked all the time, right? Oh, the sleeping giant, and what can we do to make, we hear that all the time as we try to reach out to Latino voters. But it's interesting how in this last 10 years, certainly since 2006, how we've seen that narrative shift. My dissertation work is on the 2006 immigration marches, and I was really. It all came about because I thought, oh my gosh, the 2006 marches, incredible. The biggest marches in the history of the United States. Let me say that again. The biggest marches in the history of the United States. Biggest.
Sounds like a dissertation.
Yeah, doesn't it? I was like, I gotta write about this. And I thought, wait a minute, how could something so visual, right? We all saw the pictures. Los Angeles, all these white T-shirts, everyone with the white T-shirts. There's a sea of white, million people participated, blah, blah, blah. I said, wow, that's so visible. Boo. We didn't get immigration reform. Boo. It was invisible. We were invisible. But wait. 1 million people. How can 1 million people be invisible? And when I say invisible, I mean in terms of making a change in public policy. And so that's kind of what sort of stemmed my dissertation and the work that I'm doing. But when we talk, going back again to political activism and thinking about the DREAM Act, and now, fast forward today, DACA, and what that means, it's just interesting how we are now tapping into these groups of Latinos that we've never really thought of before in terms of engagement, right? The ultimate irony to me is that the largest, I wrote it down. Where did I write it down? Because it was so awesome, I had to just write it down. And I wrote it down here. The highest level of political activism, when we think of political activism and being in the streets and reading and tweeting, is with the group with the lowest percentage of eligible voters. How did that happen? How in the world did that happen? It's interesting, right? And it's funny because when we talk about the 2006 marches, and when I think about the 2006 marches, and we've seen groups try to recreate the 2006 marches, they can't do it. They've tried. We've seen it. We've gotten the emails. We've gotten the texts. They just have not been able to recreate the 2006 marches. And I think part of that is because there was what I call a clear and present danger, right? We knew that there was this HR 4437 that basically said, you're going to be illegal. And so people felt an immediate threat, immediate danger to their daily lives. So people came out. One of the many hats that I wear is I also moderate focus groups. And I happened to be in Baltimore, and I was moderating a focus group about how do we get Latinos to register to vote and then go vote? This was about 2 months ago. I go in, it's in English, it's all Latinos. Everybody want to talk about Trump. So at one point I said, no more talking about Trump. We're not talking about Trump. Trump is not the topic of our discussion this morning. And after the focus group, it was really interesting because the people who were sort of sponsoring the legislation just couldn't understand, because when the focus group participants were talking, when they talked about Trump, they never really talked about his policy positions. It was more about talking about how he disrespected them. It was fascinating. And they found that to be true in other groups. So it wasn't so much that, because these groups were citizens, they were voting age, voting participants, they had a history of voting. And when you asked them what's important to me, immigration wasn't important to them. But yet, they were deeply upset by what Trump said. So it was this disconnect. It's like, well, wait a minute. Why are they upset with what Trump is saying about immigration when immigration doesn't really matter to them? It doesn't make sense. And that's when I tried to explain, well, because it's not about immigration. It's about disrespecting Latinos as a community. So I thought that was interesting. And I'll leave you with this in terms of when we think about Dreamers and DACA and that impact that it's had in terms of changing the narrative. And you can always look to these presidential national campaigns as a barometer to what's going on because, and I'm sure many of you have heard that Hillary Clinton has a Latino outreach director. Her name is Lorela Barali. She's a dreamer. Feel the burn with Bernie Sanders. He has Cesar Vargas, excuse me. So we're seeing the presidential campaigns integrating dreamers into their organization. You want to go, they can't vote? But yet, they're still integrating in the campaign, and why is that? Because the face of political activism has changed. It's now dreamers. And I think that's a good thing. Things are being fought out in the courts, and we're going to look to Dr. Filletes to be there when, as DACA is now going to go to the Supreme Court, more than likely. And we're going to sit on our hands and wring our fingers and see what happens with that. But I'm going to end there because I hope I can open a dialogue and we can begin to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the long-term political empowerment. If we're talking to non-voters, how does that affect our ability to turn out voters? If we're dealing with issues like immigration, where every poll shows Latinos don't, it's low on Latino voting population, Latinos that vote, immigration is not important in terms of, I shouldn't say it's not important. In terms of what's most important, it always falls towards the bottom. It's education, jobs. And so I think that becomes an interesting challenge, right? The new face of Latino political activism is about dreamers and immigration, yet that's an issue with voting Latinos that's not really a high priority for us. Interesting challenge for people like James, who's in the business of communicating to Latinos nationally. So I'll leave it with that.
Thanks. So we have until 4:45. Just a kind of quick overview. It's really interesting because we kind of hit all of the phases of political engagement, from the grassroots to the passage of legislation, the lobbying that goes into that, and then when the legislation fails or needs to be challenged in court, bringing in organizing, bringing in scholarship, bringing in the law. It's really an interesting array of skills and forces here, so we got a lot of experience and talent. So we'll open it up. I saw your hand first. Go ahead, sir.
Well, the thing about dreamers, the way I look at it, is looking at Bowling Alone, Putnam's book. We're so tainted in this country, and there are so many efforts to remove us from the political process, that the dreamers who come from Mexico, which has a history of revolution, of mobilization of populations at very grassroots level, are coming here and doing these things. The other component is that U.S. foreign policy promotes democracy promotion through USAID, NED, Republican Institute, and is just paranoid and if not totally neurotic about pushing countries to do elections. But a democracy hath not, or be not only about elections. And that is another neurotic, paranoid, what do you call it? Hofstadter wrote this book, The Paranoid Style of American Politics, and that's what it is. And so the mainstream U.S. Population, even marginalized communities, are tainted. We're completely removed. If you look at Putnam's book, which I think explains a lot of it, as well as going back to the 1940s with what was his name, The Lonely Crowd. He starts a lot of this research, sociological research and such.
I mean, it's interesting to see how the dreamer movement is trying to maneuver through these very complicated laws. Part of the research that I did, the professor and I, we crossed over to Laredo, and we got to witness firsthand the Dream 30. So we went to the church where they were housing and being trained, because these are essentially dreamers that were deported to Mexico, and they were going to challenge the law by crossing back. So we went to Mexico. We interviewed them as they were preparing. It was a whole 3-day preparation, from literally making sure you had the right amount of coins in your hand when you crossed over, so that you could, pay the tarifa when you went across. So it was absolutely amazing. So we cross over. So we're walking with the dreamers, and they're all wearing cap and gowns. This is all political theater. And I got my video camera. And part of this is, when I talk about maneuvering, because they're not really sure. I'm going to throw them under the bus. They didn't quite know what they were doing legally. They're challenging laws and not sure what the outcome was going to be. So you had some minors that were there with their parents. So you had these 2 young girls with their mom and their dad. They decided as a family that the dad was going to stay in Mexico and that the mom would cross with the girls, and that hopefully the girls and the mom wouldn't get separated. I'm videotaping as the father is saying goodbye to the mom and the girls. And I'm like, ugh. It was just like hard. So I'm literally watching families being split apart. We cross the border, we're walking. I'm scared to death. And I've got a freaking passport. I have a freaking passport and I'm scared to death.
Scared too.
It's scary. As we're crossing and we're chanting and blah, 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 they have these boats that have these big fans that are really loud. And they start crossing, boom, 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 so that we couldn't hear, because they had organized people on the American side to chant. We're crossing, they're chanting, so it was like, kind of like, the football field. Who's got spirit? I do. Who's got spirit? I do. Kind of like that. Well, they drowned us out. They literally drowned us out with these boats. So we cross over, and we split up. I got my passport. My professor and I, we go this way. They go into detention. We followed them to El Paso, where they were in the detention center. And I am happy to report that this maneuvering through the system, Mom and the girls got released. They didn't go to the detention center. They were able to get out. It had to do with I don't know. I'm too busy in my dissertation right now to go, but when I finish that, we'll go back to that research. But so my professor, he's kind of taking the lead on that research. But it was terribly fascinating.
Yeah, this what you're talking about as far as political participation is really something that I'm seeing as a result of the non-responsiveness of the political system and the way the Voting Rights Act is being rolled back. Some of us really think that the next challenge, in the closing arguments of the congressional redistricting lawsuit, the lawyer for the state implied that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was out of date, and the Supreme Court needed to reconsider it, or think about it anyway. And I think that's one of the reasons that they haven't been able to finish writing their opinion yet. And that's what I meant. If it gets to the Supreme Court level, we're in real trouble. But you know what that means, is that's proof that this political system is being unresponsive. The reason that the Dreamers are the new face of political participation is because we're going back to the 50s, and we're going to start the civil rights movement all over again. The only place we're going to be, be able to get the system to be responsive is demonstrations and being in the streets again. Yeah, that's what's going to happen, I think.
With Texas getting ready to be open carry, that's going to be kind of scary.
I don't even want to talk about the racial implications of that.
No, I have a plan. I think we should get every Latino to get open carry and then do a Cesar Chavez march. Then I'd be like, whoa. Exactly.
That Senator.
That would change. That would change the parameters
I don't
of
think he'd
the.
approve, he was a passive.
I know.
That would be Senator Tommy Williams' worst
being
nightmare.
facetious. I'm being facetious.
I'm going to just go in order of hands I saw in the back, Matt. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Flores, and I do have a comment for
Laura.
Laura. Hi. So, my question for Dr. Flores is, how do you had a model of racial intent model.
Yeah.
And so you create this model to determine what is racism.
Yeah.
So in looking at lawsuits, particularly desegregation lawsuits, looking back, because the analysis is a modern analysis, but looking back on the case, how do I determine what is racial intent when even though it seems obvious to me, like you said, you're looking at it from a Chicano point of view.
Yeah.
To me, gerrymandering is pretty obvious to me that it's a racial intent, and drawing attendance boundaries is a racial intent, but you're saying that that's not.
No, you can use, in my model, you have to use that. You have to use those things, yes, but there's more to it. And one of the things that I like about what Nina does in her lawsuits is she always includes a historian on the trial team. Usually it's Andres Tijerina, who's I think around here today or going to be here tomorrow. But
Who's awesome.
huh?
Who's awesome.
Yeah. No, I really respect Andres. He's really got his stuff together. But anyway, part of the proof in the pudding is the telling of our story. So what you need to do is say, okay, race relations, and I speak about it in here, race relations between Anglos and Latinos in Texas started in 1821 when Stephen F. Austin crossed the Sabine River. And then you start bringing up all kinds of different examples of that relationship all the way through. So it's very clear to the court that it's a cultural history of Texas is racist. The relationship between Anglos and Mexicans, and Montejano wrote a book about it that covered 100 years, but it's more than 100 years, and it covers a lot of different areas of public policy. So you have to, it's like, it's part of the evidentiary standards of in a civil lawsuit. You pile on as much as you possibly can, but it's got to be very substantive. So one of the things is for every trial and every incident, you build the history. You write Chicano history, and you present it to the court. That's part of it. Yeah.
Right. But you can still have a judge that doesn't see that doesn't. This is his own decision.
When Earl Warren heard Gus Garcia arguing in Hernandez v. Texas, he had never heard it before.
Right.
He had seen Mexicans in California, but he had never heard the story that Gus told.
Oh.
So judges know intellectually, yeah. But, one of the things, part of the job of an expert witness is to educate the judge. And so one of the things we do is the evidence we have, we put in the form of a story that has a beginning, has an end, it's unified all the way through, it's very well organized, and Nina does all the organization, lays all that strategy out for us. She just plugs us into this matrix one at a time. And as long as it's smooth and very clear and logical, they hear the story. And only a confirmed racist would totally disagree with it. But part of it is telling Chicano history.
With respect to the Voting Rights Act, the problem is I don't know education, civil rights law as well to say what's there, but I bet somebody else in this room does.
Well, part of the problem is education's not necessarily seen as an actual constitutional right. And even, I mean, Rodriguez versus San Antonio says that yes, the federal government has a duty to make sure that people do get an education. That doesn't necessarily mean we can argue, I have a constitutional right, just like your immigration students. You know, the Dreamers in DACA, you know, I teach at UT RGV, and we have the largest population of Dreamers, and a lot of them are in my classes. And so my civil rights class has to write a paper, a research paper, answering or addressing the question, are immigration rights civil rights? And that can, you know, that can also apply to education. Are education rights civil rights? Are immigration rights civil rights? You know, why should the court, say that they are?
So I was, and it doesn't address that point, but I was just going to say that in enacting and revising the Voting Rights Act over the years, there are these things called the Senate factors, and that's where the history of discrimination comes in. So the Senate has said, here's some things that every court should look at, and it's made its way into essentially common law now. So it comes up in every case. That you should look to these, 11 things?
Yeah.
That will tell you, that will indicate that there's a violation of the Voting Rights Act, that there's discrimination that goes back to a violation of the Constitution. And so I don't know if there's something like that in education, but it's clear to every court that the history matters because that's kind of in the law. That's the way you interpret the Voting Rights Act and apply it. History matters, X, Y, Z.
Yeah, if you go to that lawsuit, Arlington Heights, Village of Arlington Heights versus Metropolitan Housing Development Corporation, I think it's a 1972 law, or case. In one of the footnotes, you'll find the 11 different variables. There's 10 substantive variables, and there's another one that's a catch-all, alia. But what I did in my book was I took them all, and I deconstructed the variables, and I built 4 big variables. And I describe in my book the kind of evidence that goes in each one of those variables.
I wanted to address something, Laura, that you kind of left as a question. The many hats I wear, one of them is being an activist in LULAC, Legal United Latin American, which, is sad enough that it's split. It has and I'm going to put it real bluntly, it has a Republican, it has a Democratic way of thinking, and sometimes the Democratic part we're with MALDEF, which I love MALDEF, but then the other side fights us, even sues it's a nightmare. But, that's kind of the things that happen. But in our group, we have a large number of Dreamers here at UT. And James, you might agree to this, I don't know if you won't, but they have a vitality that I have found to be exciting, because even though they're not American citizens, they dearly want to become one, right? So they influence. And people like me, because I'm American born, right? I mean, most of those of us that call it Tejanos or Chicanos or whatever, we're American born. So we don't have becoming an American citizen a priority. When I do, but I'm just saying, most of us do not.
Exactly.
They tend to influence or affect those who are sitting on the bench at home watching television or going to a football game or dances or whatever, and not thinking about politics. Now, I grew up in politics, so I don't go to bed without thinking about something that has to do with politics, but they are dragging some of those folks out of bed or, out of their house. So I think of them as a very great group to use in campaigning these days. The other thing is the anger or the jealousy or the stupidity between Mexican American born in the United States versus an immigrant who's come here and trying to get citizenship or has already attained it. When I worked for Ann Richards' campaign in I was working Hidalgo County and Cameron County. I had union money I had gone down there with, so we were trying to influence the vote in a nonpartisan way. It was awful what I would hear between the Mexicanos that were born in Brownsville versus the Mexicanos that would come every day to work in Brownsville that came from Mexico. It's a horrible, horrible, that was created not by us, but by the whites in the society, because it was like, they're getting your welfare, they're getting you this. Their kids are winning valedictorian, their kid, oh my God, it was awful, and here I am. They considered me a Yankee because I came from Austin. And because I said, stop doing that. This country was, unfortunately, its growth has come from immigrants, right? I mean, I mean that because the boats came from England and not the ones that are from here, But they came here and they made this nation what it is, along with us, of course, or without our backs there. They couldn't have done it. So stop fighting with the immigrants. So we have to, within our own self, resolve that.
Yeah.
Because it has not gotten better. I used to think it was only in Brownsville. Oh no, my God, I've seen it here in Austin too. I've seen it when I worked in Brownsville. I was fortunate to work in 39 states in the United States, and I've seen it all over the country.
Yeah.
So we have got to find a way to end that, because that's how they're splitting our vote too.
Yeah.
And they're affecting our vote because of that hate between those two different things.
And I want to go back to your first point about the Dreamers and how aspirational and they can be. But it's interesting because I had the opportunity, because I've sort of been involved with the Dreamers for a while. I was over at A&M. They had a conference. All the Dreamers, they're very organized.
Oh, very.
They came from all over Texas. And one of my colleagues, Andy Hernandez, and I did this whole messaging session with them because they had just done this big press conference. And I, really, share with me what your message was. We're here, we're not afraid, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whoa! I said, whoa, you're scaring white people. You're scaring white people. Why don't you talk about how, you graduated from high school, how you're American, how you've never been to Mexico, I said, there's different messages for different audiences. And I said, but you're scaring white people. And you kind of, if we're going to make this DACA thing or DREAM Act stick, we kind of need white people. We need white people to jump on board. And so it was a very interesting discussion because part of the thing we talked about was this notion of, I didn't come here, I was brought by my parents. My parents, brought me here. It wasn't by my own volition. And they had a hard time with that because they felt that was essentially blaming the parents. That they were somehow,
they would say.
Yeah.
They would say your parents did something illegal.
Exactly. And so it's a really interesting discussion because they, at that point in the movement, they were still trying to find their way. And as I've come to learn in my research, factions, igual como Lula, factions. You have those that really want to work with the establishment, the unions, go in and do sort of the establishment, and then the other ones, the Dream 30s, who are challenging, who are in the face of the law. And so you see that split as well.
So I saw 3 hands, and that'll probably take us to the end. 1, 2, and 3.
So what's going on with the 14th Amendment, since there are children being denied birth certificates in the state of Texas?
I'm deferring to the expert witness.
You don't even want to hear the back room talk about the 14th Amendment.
It's awful.
It's not just that part of it, but it's part of a bigger picture. I'm afraid that besides Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, they want to take the 14th Amendment down just in general.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely yeah.
What is treating people differently? Is it in the do you have to have an email that's where somebody says, I'm treating those people differently?
Right.
Or do you see it when you look at the statistics and you see that there's 5% of Congress that's Latino, whereas there's 11% of the voting population and even more of the entire population that's Latino?
Well,
is it in the statistics?
I just keep hearing how Mexicanos are being denied birth certificates for the children that are being born in Texas.
Right.
And even if the federal government did get involved, Texas is the first one that's going to say states' rights, and Governor Abbott's going to say, I override that. And I mean, he's doing it now with the ICE. He just did a press release saying he's going to deny people, law enforcement's budgeting because of the whole immigration issue. So,
I covered that in here too.
yeah, so,
10th Amendment
that's what I'm
issue.
saying. It's like, even if they do pass the Dreamer at a federal level, Texas is gonna be the first one to say,
Nah.
hey, you can't tell us what to do.
Yeah,
So-
right.
God, his mother-in-law calls him mijo and everything. Darn it.
Well, and I love how my wife is the first Latina lady.
Oh,
that's what I'm
But
saying.
it's like, the Mexican side, it's just like, God, dude, really?
And the Bushes have a problem.
And there are actually Latinos that voted for that dude. I don't get it. I do not get it.
And don't forget that, I mean, at least for the moment, we have the 14th Amendment, but Congress is, the faction of Congress is hard at work in saying that the 14th Amendment doesn't mean what we
Well,
think
and
it
that's
means.
what I'm trying to get at too. It's like they're breaking the law, not giving those people birth certificates. So where's the big brother? Who's the law enforcement saying you're breaking the law? Give those people a birth certificate.
They're trying to stop demography as destiny. Demography is destiny. We're having babies. They're not. You see all the charts. We're outpacing them. And that means that political power is going to change. They're going to do everything they're not going to say, oh, y'all the majority now. Come sit next to me. Let's share power. Oh, hell no. We're going to have to grab it and take it.
Yeah, that actually came out in the transcript of in the state legislature. They talked about that. One of the reasons they had to pass voter ID was because they're having too many babies. The population's changing. I mean,
so those guys who are being told no, they're not.
Yeah,
gonna get a birth
And guess what? That means they can't vote.
as a footnote, after this whole thing was over and after I'd written the book, I got a confidential call from a lobbyist here in Austin who heard Senator Tommy Williams talking about the reason Senate Bill 14 was passed was to suppress the Latino vote. They had to minimize the vote, and that's what they were going to do. He said it to his other two colleagues. I couldn't use it because I had to protect the source.
Yeah.
He called me in my office.
Let's, 1, 2, and then we'll wrap up and go down to mingle a bit. Go ahead.
I'm Grace Shemaine with the League of Women Voters of Texas. We're all about voting, nonpartisan. Tell me 3 practical things or 3 messages that I could use to help try to get the Latino voting to increase. I know I already heard that one.
Oh, God.
Get the dreamers to
All right,
vote.
you're the
Yeah,
message
I'm
person.
the message person. You need to
Yeah.
get a talking puppy. Talking puppy will do
Yes,
it.
cat.
Talking cat.
Okay.
That's a joke for those in marketing. You get it right. God, help me.
I know. right? Well, I don't wanna-
James.
I don't want to leave you in the cracks.
James is like, James is, if y'all don't know who James Alderete is, he's a colleague and an incredible mind, and he ran Obama's campaign in 08, and I was privileged to be a part of the Latino media team in Obama's 08, and he handled Obama in 2012. And so, do you want to speak to that, James? I want to defer that to you.
First, I just want to say there's also a huge source. Dr. Barreto's here.
Oh, yes,
So
Dr.
the
Barreto.
LatinoDecisions.com blog is an incredible source for information. I'd say too many people probably jump to the fear aspect to it. Trump does talk to folks a lot, but when people feel disenfranchised, they need to first just be welcomed in.
Yep.
They need to feel part and connected to stuff. The 2 top predictors of one's likelihood of voting is age, and we have a very young community. The second is education, but because the population growth is driven by second generation, they may be surpassing their parents' educational level, but that's still not far, and economic factors can often derail them. But you get them to talk about politics, and so immigration is definitely a lens on how they're looking at political parties, but education and economic opportunities are why we're here and why we're staying.
Yeah, you know, one thing that y'all could really push for, I think, is civic education in schools.
Right.
Getting the schools
Well, you
to
have a state law that says you're supposed to be registering all your students when they're in high school. You're supposed to have a voter
Get them in-
register, and they're not doing it.
somebody get them to enforce it.
I didn't say it very artfully, but if you Google "great unengaged," didn't you guys actually do that for us? Yes. Dr. Barreto again can tell you more about this. But we did some focus groups and a survey of people of lower propensity voters a couple of years ago. And one of the best answers that came out of that, or the first one that always pops to my mind, is what I was trying to say, which is trusted members of your family, people that you know and trust and respect in your community are all other things being equal, the most likely to have some effect on people who don't feel like it's going to make a difference if they go out and vote. And we hope that at least a few of those people, even if we can't convince them that they're going to see some change if they vote, will at least consider it if somebody says, please, will you come and vote?
They have that
Yeah.
barber.
And there's other little things you can do, like pledge cards and other little things.
Voter
that-
registration is great.
Well,
Yeah,
importantly,
registrar.
are you a registrar? How many of you in this room are registrars? And, you know, carrying those cards with you and asking everybody and talking to them and give them a card and get them to register, like Rachel carries.
I carry mine everywhere I go.
Not a registrar.
Everywhere I go.
Yes.
Everywhere I go.
Love
And
it.
every 2 years, I renew it.
Nice. Which, by the way, they also complicated that process.
Yeah, but you know, we
To-
learned
to-
so that we're
yeah.
at the doors, when I'm knocking on doors in the neighborhood, I tell them, this is what has changed. You still need to vote.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Tejanos are not voting.
There's
And
a
so
lot of
that's-
people that are not
Yeah,
voting.
but the people that I talk to, it doesn't matter. My vote doesn't matter. It matters. And we need to reiterate that.
Tell that story, that racist story does happen.
All right, we're winding down. Any last comments, questions, and then we'll let the
Can we stay
panel.
all night?
Did I see one other? I thought I saw another hand in the back.
If you serve martinis, we'll stay all night.
Okay. That's Maggie. You can close us out.
I know someone who has tried to start a campaign this year here in Austin of getting teams of people together, and everybody will agree to take 10 people to the polls on election day.
We need a strategy. We can't just keep, you know, like this. It's like we need to get together, get it down, agree that it's a good thing, and then go out and do it. Like registrars, getting 10 people, you know, we need to get together.
Yeah, and then I'll do one shameless plug for Dr. Barreto's organization. Latino Decisions has the best polling data that you can find. Google him. They do incredible newsletters. They have incredible data.
Yeah, they're the foremost
He's right
Latino
there.
polling organization in the nation.
They do it on everything. They do statewide. They do national. It's an amazing,
Yeah.
amazing resource.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are refreshments downstairs in the lobby at 5 p.m. Let's give a round of applause to the panel. Thank you all. And stories and organizing. Go tell some stories, go organize.